Okay, I think we can start now. Thank you all for coming, despite the fabulous weather outside, to this year's conference, which is entitled Predicaments of the Left, Conjunctures, Strategies, Perspectives. So first of all, I would like to thank the people from the Goethe-Institut for their generosity to allow us to have this conference here in their premises. Then our partners and support, not only financial supporters, but also the people who conceptually encouraged all of this, make all of this possible, the people from the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, the office Southeast Europe, that is Belgrade, above all Ana Veselinović, Boris Kanzleiter, and Krunoslav Stojaković. And of course, I also thank all of the people who agreed to participate at this conference. This includes, of course, Benjamin Opratko, our speaker for tonight for the first lecture. Benjamin is from Vienna. He works at the Institute for Political Science at the University of Vienna. And he has written a book, recently, last year it came out.
Yes.
It's called Hegemony or Hegemony, and it's I would like, it's fair to say, a history of the reception of the concept of hegemony, and which makes the book interesting is that it includes three major strands rather than just one, that is cultural studies, post-Marxism, and also international political economy. And this is one of the reasons we were so keen to have Benjamin here, is precisely because he deals, as is obvious from the title, with Gramsci, and when conceiving this year's conference, it became clear to us that that Gramsci is an author whose time for us here, we believe, has really arrived. And then the question is, of course, why Gramsci, why here, and why now? And well, first we can say that the current reception of Gramsci's work at universities in Zagreb mostly evolves around his reception in cultural studies and post-Marxism, which often entails his work being filtered through post-structuralism or Lacanian psychoanalysis and similar strands. What is often lost is Gramsci as an eminently strategic thinker, who, in fact, never gave up on his commitment to the revolution or the revolutionary transformation of existing social relations. And, well, what makes Gramsci specific, and Benjamin will, of course, elaborate on this, I believe, much more, but just as a general outline for you to get maybe a short introduction, is, well, against what has been in Marxism often a very mechanistic view of political transformation, especially in the Second International. Gramsci has developed much more sophisticated and much more complex concepts to understand, political transformation, which cannot be automatically derived from, well, the development of the forces of production and so forth. One defining moment of Gramsci's work, I would argue, but Benjamin may agree or may not agree, is of course the specific situation in which he worked, and which maybe can be described as theoretically acknowledging the failure of the revolutions in Western Europe, that is, the failure to emulate the October Revolution. So it is, one could argue, his work is situated in the context of defeat of the left, but at the same time it tries to conceptually grasp the reasons for this defeat and to find the adequate framework for its strategic overcoming. And another reason why Gramsci seems so important, especially here, is what one could argue is a very peculiar lack of reception or a lack of depth of reception of Gramsci's work. Well, in former Yugoslavia, many Marxist authors, even second and third rate, one could argue, have been systematically translated, but Gramsci never received the full attention he probably deserved. The prison notebooks, as far as I know, have never been published in more than a few extracts. So, of course, there are specific historical reasons for this. If Gramsci's problematic was the problem of a revolution that failed to arrive, one could argue that in the context of former Yugoslavia, where a socialist revolution was achieved or perceived itself as to be achieved, much of his problematic may have seemed obsolete. Well, I believe that we now, to a certain extent, suffer the consequences of this lack of reception. To give only one example, had there been a proper dealing with Gramsci's work, I believe one could have prevented ideological naiveties such as a very rigid and unsophisticated opposition between, for example, the state and civil society, which was very predominant in the discourse of the 90s here. So this just to give you a very short introduction to why you're going to listen, what you're going to be listening now. And so, but one more thing before I give the word to Benjamin, I would ask you please to, all of you present here, to sign in this list of participants, which is simply a bureaucratic necessity. So thank you very much, and Benjamin.
So this seems to work, right. Thank you very much, Stipe, for your kind introduction, and especially thank you very much to all the organizers who made this conference possible and gave me the opportunity to speak tonight, which is really exciting for me. And also, having read the abstracts of the coming talks and lectures for the coming 2 days, I think that will be a really, really interesting get-together, really interesting discussion we can have. As Stipe indicated, what I'm trying to do is, in a way, introduce some basic Gramscian concepts. I will, however, not systematically introduce them, but rather try to develop a more contemporary argument relating to the current political conjuncture in Europe. And in the course of these arguments, I try to introduce them through the back door, if you will. So if any of these key concepts that will emerge during my talk remain unclear at the end of my talk, I'm sure we will have the time and the room for debate and for questions, and maybe we can get back to that later then. So the title of my talk is Hegemony and Authoritarian Neoliberalism, and it may seem rather vague at first sight, but it refers to, I'd say, the overriding concern of my presentation here, the leitmotif, Gramsci may have said. And its underlying claim is that we can learn a great deal from Antonio Gramsci and the theories he developed back in the 1920s, 1930s in Italy for a better understanding of the current political conjuncture, the current political situation. And the theory that Gramsci developed in the prison notebooks, and I'll come back to that peculiar literary form later. This theory has, as I think, its key concept and its core as the notion of hegemony. And specifically, I claim that the theory of hegemony can help us better understand and ultimately better intervene in the current political conjuncture, which is a conjuncture that I think can be aptly described as the conjuncture of authoritarian neoliberalism. This is, of course, not a term that originated with me, but a term that is frequently invoked in critical, scholarly, and activist debates around Europe. Now, these two terms, hegemony and authoritarian neoliberalism, in turn refer to a third notion, absent from the title, but I think very present, centrally present in the whole of the conference here, which is the notion of crisis. The conference organizers suggested in their original invitation I mean, we are kind of facing a world historical puzzle, if you will. The puzzle of the continuing political marginalization of the political left in Europe, with a few very notable and worthy of discussion exceptions, but a continuing political marginalization of the left in the face of the deepest crisis of capitalism experienced in generations. So I think that notion of crisis is what makes thinking about and thinking with Gramsci today, which makes it specifically relevant. Because after all, when Gramsci wrote, he did so in the context of the last grand crisis of capitalism, which was the crisis of the 1920s and 1930s, and he personally had to experience and to suffer from the fact that the modes in which capital tries to manage deep structural capitalist crises, or to use Gramsci's term, organic crises. These strategies of capital include the reliance on, or can include the reliance on the most openly violent, anti-democratic and coercive political forms, the capital's fascist option. And it was, as you're probably aware, only in a fascist prison cell that Gramsci had to pen down his political thoughts in these research notes. It was basically notebooks that he tried to put down his basic thoughts. It was research notes, and these research notes we can now, at least in some languages, in German and in French, we can now read as the prison notebooks. Interestingly, even in English, there is not a full translation of the prison notebooks available yet. It is still in the making. So this is the backdrop for what I'm going to do here. And also the privilege of opening such a conference brings with it the other privilege of being able to formulate some theoretical and political strategic considerations in a very open-ended way. So what I want to put up for debate really is a couple of questions and a couple of concepts that might be helpful and might inform some of the debates we are about to have. Not, of course, in the sense of setting an agenda, but as an offer, as a proposition to think about some of the topics, the contemporary topics that we will address in a certain way. Now, this proposition is organized around one key theoretical question, and that is, for me, the question of the, one could say, the hegemonic quality of neoliberal capitalism, or more precisely, what does it mean to speak of neoliberalism's hegemony, and what does it mean to speak of the current crisis 2008 and following, as a crisis of neoliberal hegemony? And it's, of course, again, important to bear in mind that this is a very broad question, and what emerges is, of course, a picture painted with a broad brush, if you will. So that's not a kind of pattern that could just be applied to any concrete political and social situation, but would have to be rather translated into the different contexts. And I'll come back to that, translated in a careful and active way. If we operate as what Gramsci said, what Gramsci called as organic intellectuals, so as not intellectuals in the highbrow professorial style intellectual, but organic intellectuals in the sense of people who actively try to intervene in political debate, in political practice, which includes activists, scholars, trade unionists, every person who has the function of organizing what we can describe as the struggle around hegemony. But I will come back to that later as well. So, the question of the hegemonic qualities of neoliberalism and the crisis of neoliberalism as a crisis of its hegemony takes as its starting point a certain political diagnosis that is present in, I'd say, not large but significant sections of the political left, both activist and academic, over Europe. And this political diagnosis is that the year of 2008, the eruption of that great crisis that we, I would argue, still live in, marked the beginning of the end of neoliberal hegemony, and that we are witnessing what the Gramscian scholar Stephen Gill within the field of international political economy called the organic crisis of neoliberalism. So for some, this might sound quite familiar and sound like a kind of echo of those voices who claimed in the first months and years after 2008 that with the crisis neoliberalism is over, it's done. We are all Keynesians now, so we have all these left liberal, left Keynesian sort of grand intellectual figures, Paul Krugman, Joseph Stiglitz, arguing in this first phase of the crisis that this is the end of neoliberalism. However, the argument for this crisis to be a crisis of neoliberal hegemony is something quite different, and this is my first entry point here, really, for what I want to say. So, for example, Mario Candeas, who will be speaking tomorrow night, I think, at this very place, and who will probably pick up on much of what I have to say here, he put it very, very clearly and very succinctly, the argument for the crisis of neoliberal hegemony. He wrote in an analysis written for the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung last year, I quote, "Neoliberalism is exhausted. In the last 10 years, its authoritarian tendency has become more pronounced, and there are no signs of an intensification or accumulation or a new social consensus. Nevertheless, the neoliberals are still in the driving seat and are expanding their institutional power. They are no longer in a position of leadership, but still in a position of domination." Now, this pair of concepts, leadership and domination, is of course picking up on one of the most famous theoretical arguments developed by Gramsci in the prison notebooks. It's an analytical differentiation of social power in class society. It's a differentiation between domination on the one hand, which for Gramsci means, and I quote here directly, exercising coercive force as a political means through the state. On the one hand, domination. On the other hand, we have what Gramsci calls intellectual and moral leadership, that is, the construction of an active or passive consensus between the leading classes and significant sections of the led, or what Gramsci calls the subalterns, those who are led within a constellation of hegemony but are not the leading parts of it, but are somehow consumed in it, but are in a subaltern way. And in light of this analytical differentiation, Gramsci develops the concept of hegemony. And hegemony is a notion with which Gramsci tries to describe in which ways ruling classes organize. The old question, what does the ruling class do when it rules? So in what ways does a ruling class rule politically? And hegemony, Gramsci argues, is, and I quote from the prison notebooks, is characterized by the combination of force and consent, which balance each other reciprocally without force predominating excessively over consent. Now, how does a leading class do that? How does a hegemonic class do that? One could argue that in a nutshell, basically the argument has three dimensions. We don't find this spelled out in Gramsci, as I said, scattered notes throughout these. In German, it's 10 big tomes of the prison notebooks. But if you read it carefully, you could say, okay, there's three dimensions to it. So first, hegemonic leadership aims at what Gramsci called the common sense, the senso comune, which means the largely taken for granted, often very contradictory, everyday assumptions about the world and about oneself. And the struggle around common sense is exactly the struggle, the cultural and ideological struggle around norms, values, and ideas, but in a very, in a practical way, not in an idealist sense, but in the sense of how do people organize everyday lives? What is considered normal? What is considered part of, common sense? What everybody should know and live by. So we have this common sense dimension of of hegemony, which today we'd probably say maybe he called it moral and ethical leadership. It has probably much to do with what we today would maybe call the discursive dimension. But Gramsci adds something very significant to this, because he says this moral intellectual leadership must be, in order to function as hegemony, must be supplemented or must be grounded in material concessions on the part of the leading classes to significant sections of the subaltern groups. So he writes, in order to sustain its hegemony, quote, "It is necessary that the leading group should make sacrifices of an economic corporate kind." Economic corporate being the concept he uses for the most narrowly economic defined interest of a certain class faction, or social group. So compromise and concessions. And third, in order to stabilize this balance of discursive and material concessions, and in order to reproduce this hegemony ideologically, politically, this needs to be inscribed, he argues, in a set of social and political institutions. And this is, on the one hand, he has this very interesting notion, he calls it hegemonic apparatus. It's a set of institutions through which a leading class develops and reproduces its hegemony, its rule, both materially and discursively. But it also relates to the concept of civil society that Stipe talked about, which is a very different concept of civil society than the one that is usually used. I don't know the circumstances in Croatia, but even in Germany, where we did have a significant reception of Gramsci, and we have the full prison notebooks. In most discussions, civil society still is considered as something opposite of the state, and something inherently normatively positive, good, as a kind of counterbalance to the evil forces that are concentrated in that coercive apparatus of domination, which is the state. For Gramsci, he has this idea that no, we have to look at the state in what he calls lo stato integrale, the integral state, which encompasses both the coercive moments of the state in its narrow sense, which he calls political society, but also all these institutions through which the ruling class reorganizes, reproduces its hegemonic rule. And this includes not just those institutions that are legally part of the state, but all kinds of social institutions, from the media to schools to trade unions, even, and parties, up until, he argues, the ways in which the architecture in a city, the names of the streets, the ways in which the streets are arranged are to be found. So we have these three dimensions of hegemony in Gramsci, and then from this on, he argues that a crisis of hegemony, what's a crisis of hegemony then? He says it refers to a process in which this delicate balance of force and consent is disrupted, and a period of relative social, economic, and political stability begins to unravel in all those three dimensions: discursive, if you will, economic, and institutional. And the term that he uses to describe these deep structural crises of capitalism is the term organic crisis. And organic here he employs this term exactly to emphasize this broad understanding of crisis. And of course, capitalist crisis has a deep and structural economic dimension. But from this economic crisis, he says, alone, nothing necessarily has to happen from this. We can speak of a deep organic crisis only in a broader sense, which includes the breaking up, if you will, of the historic ties and links between certain social classes and groups and political forces, political parties. And he argues that in a situation of organic crisis, there is a proliferation of, and I quote again, situations of conflict. And listen to this quote, it's almost as he wrote it in 2011, Greece. Situations of conflict between represented and representatives that reverberate out from the terrain of the parties, the party organizations, properly speaking, the parliamentary electoral field, newspaper organizations, throughout the state organism, reinforcing the relative power of the bureaucracy, civil and military, of high finance, of the church, and generally of all bodies relatively independent of the fluctuations of public opinion. So if we subtract the church, maybe, this is, I think, a really extraordinary contemporary repercussion, what he wrote back then. So we have this dimension of breaking up of historic links between, or it's called the crisis of representation. And this political institutional dimension of the crisis in turn is articulated, Gramsci argues, in an organic crisis with the erosion of moral leadership, of the discursive basis of the ruling class's hegemony. And again, Gramsci captures this quite well in a paragraph of the Prison Notebooks where he writes, quote, "If the ruling class has lost its consensus, i.e. is no longer leading but only dominant, exercising coercive force alone, this means precisely that the great masses have become detached from their traditional ideologies and no longer believe what they used to believe previously." So this idea of domination and leadership, these two related terms, we find them here as we find them later on in Candeas and others, talking about the current crisis. And Gramsci goes on in this passage, and he then uses a phrase that has become almost proverbial. They even put up placards in Vienna, I think 1 or 2 years ago, where they put, for some reason, I don't know, it wasn't any left-wing organization, but this, I think it was the City Council of Vienna that just wanted to have nice philosophical statements on the walls, and they put this quote up there: "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." Tellingly, the second part of this was omitted in the morbid symptoms nobody wanted to read about on the posters around the city. So now, what does it mean to use this perspective on hegemony and crisis that Gramsci proposes to think about the current crisis? First, I would say it gives us a serious advantage because it counters different, I would say, narrow, maybe economistic interpretations, understandings of the current situation of the current crisis that are in some parts of the political left in Europe present. By which I mean that a Gramscian perspective argues both against a kind of leftist catastrophism and against a left-wing pragmatism. So it argues against a discourse of apocalypse, the end is nigh. I don't know, any Game of Thrones readers here? Winter is coming. That's basically, one. The rest, okay. So winter is coming. We are facing a situation where capital is structurally unable to solve its own crisis without plunging ever more sections of the world's population in misery. And basically this kind of argument kind of renews the old socialism versus barbarianism, the last big struggle is ahead of us argument. But it also argues, and like with the term of organic crisis we can counter this, this discourse, I think, but it also argues against left liberal or neo-Keynesian pragmatisms that see the crisis primarily as a problem of economic policies, like the lack of international embedding of financial markets and so on. If we do that, a bit of Keynesian stimulus packages, and sooner or later we'll be back on track. So this is kind of a negative, anti-economistic, if you will, argument. But from this derives, I think, a second more substantial one, and this reads the current efforts of the dominant political agents in Europe, which means national governments, the complex ensemble of the European state apparatuses, the IMF, the World Bank, and what have you, that their strategies to implement the harshest austerity measures can be read as a strategy of domination, to reinforce the neoliberal project in the context of its own eroding hegemony. So the argument goes something like this: lacking the necessary resources of an expansive hegemonic project, both in its discursive and in its material economic sense, these institutions, in which the dominant world market-oriented factions of capital are condensed, necessarily and increasingly have to rely on what Gramsci called the coercive force. And I think this is this is obviously the case when you look at the European periphery. If you look at Greece, where the brutal crackdown really on social infrastructure, on pensions, on wages was pushed through in a blatantly undemocratic way. So it's the reliance of on coercive force is very clear here. But there also exist a number of very interesting studies now and analyses that translate this hypothesis into analysis of the policies and institutional structures of the European Union itself and in Europe and in the core of Europe. So there's a number of scholars, the German-speaking parts of Europe, for example, Hans-Jürgen Bieling or Lukas Oberndorfer, that have shown that the European Union's crisis management, that includes the ESM, the six-pack, the Euro Plus package, all these mechanisms of what they call economic governance, dramatically limit the scope for democratic deliberation and decision-making, even in its limited liberal representative sense. And as, for example, Lukas Oberndorfer shows, some of them, such as the Fiscal Compact, operate by design in open violation of European law. And last but not least, and this would be an instance of coercive force, of domination instead of leadership. And last but not least, the use of force and state violence against protests and demonstrations in Europe, the employment of increasingly draconian laws to intimidate social movements, and also the widespread use of surveillance techniques, both off and online, could be read as indicators of such a broad shift in the hegemonic qualities of the current social and political power structure. So the argument for a crisis of neoliberal hegemony is not to be mistaken with the argument for the imminent demise of the neoliberal project. On the contrary, it tries to come to terms with the fact that while the crisis in 2008 was indeed a crisis of neoliberal capitalism, which means it was a crisis that was caused by the internal structural contradiction of the neoliberal historic bloc and the inability of the leading social forces to continue to contain these contradictions within their political project, but that out of this crisis, capital was able to form an even more radical version of the neoliberal project that has as its guiding principle, as Lukas Oberndorfer calls it, austerity forever. You can read that from a number, if you read the speeches of Angela Merkel and others, that is basically what European crisis management now is about. So in this reading, neoliberalism has lost its hegemonic capabilities, but that made it just more ferocious in its quest to organize the class struggle from above. Therefore, neoliberalism mutated from hegemonic to authoritarian. So that is the argument of those who argue for the crisis of neoliberalism, of neoliberal hegemony, in a nutshell. And I think that this diagnosis captures a series of really important key features of the current political conjuncture, and it's I think an interesting and necessary starting point to investigate also the strategic challenges and possibilities for political strategies for an anti-neoliberal and also an anti-capitalist left. However, in some of its versions, this argument carries, I would say, a certain danger or potential flaw, and this is what I want to address now. The problem is this: the hypothesis of authoritarian neoliberalism, in the way that I presented it, carries with it an insinuation that goes something like that. Neoliberalism lost its elements of consensus. Coercive force comes to the fore. So what are we going to expect? We are going to expect a coming period of increasing aggravation and intensification of struggles, with capital and the state relying on increasingly naked, unveiled forms of violence. And this again implies the logic of escalation that we really wanted to avoid, in the first place. So there is, in some versions of this argument, the implicit logic of the great last battle between the forces of labor, the subalterns, and democracy on the one side, and capital and despotism on the other. And this, I think, is a strategic problem, and is also a strategic problem because it seriously underestimates the political, ideological, and cultural strategies that dominant social forces employ in the current phase of authoritarian neoliberalism. And to counter this danger, this potential flaw within the Gramscian analysis, I believe two qualifications should be discussed. And one operates on a theoretical level, and one rests more on a historical, analytical argument. And these are the two things that I want to do now. Now, the theoretical objection, it will probably not surprise you, goes back to Gramsci himself and to his own determination of the concept of hegemony. Now, as I indicated before, what we today read as Gramsci's prison notebooks is in fact a collection of research notes never intended for publication in this form, and it's literally riddled with ambiguities, with insinuations, with historical analogies, and indeed with a number of what Perry Anderson, in a very early piece of reception of Gramsci, called the antinomies, which he was keen to remind everybody that existed in these prison notebooks. And this has led to a sweeping debate over, we could now say, more than 6 decades, starting, of course, in Italy, but then with the first translations of the prison notebooks, parts of the prison notebooks in the 70s, into English and also into German and French. You had a proliferation of debates that basically centered around questions of interpretation. So what we have, looking back now at these different interpretations, we have varying, what another Gramsci scholar, Alistair Davidson, called the varying seasons of Gramsci studies. And I mean, it would be a whole new topic to discuss these, because of course they have to be related to, again, the political conjunctures. And as you said, Stipe, who wanted to, the ways in which Gramsci was translated, if he was translated at all, by whom he was translated, who selected the pieces that got translated, and those who were not, were heavily overdetermined by political and very concretely political strategical considerations on all kinds of parts. So everybody wanted his own piece of Gramsci, from the Communist Party of Italy to the new social movements, from the post-structuralists to the Euro-communists, and the variety, and the liberals, and the especially in Italy. So we have these various seasons of Gramsci studies over either the most correct, or in the more interesting, I think, debates, the more useful and politically useful interpretations of Gramsci's most important theoretical insights, categories, arguments. Now, what we have today, and I think still today, is that from these debates emerged the concept of hegemony that is sometimes reduced to the aspect of consensual leadership, to what's called the cultural coordination of interest, if you will, one of the 3 defining characteristics, I would argue, of hegemony. So that hegemony in the end is defined, such as recently in a recently published Introduction to Cultural Studies, they put it, hegemony is the winning of consent in order to gain and maintain power, which is hardly recognizable if you read the prison notebooks as Gramsci's concept. And you could, and this is Max Weber, or this is Jürgen Habermas, or this is any other thing but Gramsci. And the problem with this is not just that it is philologically unsound. I mean, then you could say, well, what the heck? We're not philologists, we want to do something with that. But the problem on a theoretical level, I think, is that it produces a dichotomy between hegemony or consent on the one side and force or coercion on the other, that is inconsistent with Gramsci's, not with the letter of Gramsci's argument, but with the the leitmotif, with the central political argument, the central political insinuations that Gramsci wanted to put forward in the prison notebooks and also in his political life before that as a political activist, as a communist. So although there are a few formulations in the notebooks that lend credibility to such an interpretation that reduces hegemony to consent, I think a careful reading reveals that Gramsci understood the process of hegemony as a relationship or a delicate balance, and I read that this quote to you earlier, between consent and coercion. So if you remember the quote, Gramsci refers to the exercise of hegemony as a combination of force and consent. And this paragraph then continues with, I think, a very crucial specification, because he writes, "Indeed, the attempt is always made to ensure that force will appear to be based on the consent of the majority." So here we have no dichotomy of consent and force between leadership on the one hand and domination on the other. And it's not as if, because in some of the interpretations, it's almost like a hydraulics of power. You know, if one goes up, the other must come down. So if you have, you have more coercion, more violence, then the consent level drops. And I think this is a picture that informs some, I wouldn't say most, but at least some of the arguments that are currently put forward within, broadly speaking, Gramscian scholars working on analysis of the current political situation. And I think it's a highly problematic one. Because if we take that last quote of Gramsci seriously, then we would expect that in periods of hegemonic crisis, in which elements of consensus and leadership do erode, and political representation, as we saw, become fragile, then we would have to expect not only an intensification of coercion, force, and open violence, but we would have to expect at the same time intensified and renewed efforts on the parts of the dominant classes to recreate new or strengthen old elements of consensus, of moral and intellectual leadership. So then the important question to ask from a strategic viewpoint would not be so much, is coercive force and authoritarianism growing strong and social consensus weakening, but rather, what are the efforts on the part of the ruling classes to, in Gramsci's words, ensure that force will appear to be based on the consent of the majority? How are they trying to reconstruct hegemony while at the same time employing these instruments of coercion, of violence, that shape the European strategies of crisis management? So that's the theoretical qualification and argument. Then there's a second one, and this goes even more a little deeper, and I hope you can follow me on this one, but maybe we can discuss it afterwards. It's an historical and analytical argument that takes the question, or that raises the question, in what ways was neoliberalism hegemonic in the first place, until the crisis of 2008? Now, I've argued we have these three dimensions: economic, discursive, institutional. And when you look at the historic period from the 1980s onwards, it's kind of difficult to grasp where these hegemonic dimensions are present, really. Because what we have is a relatively stable configuration of social forces, a relatively stable balance of force and consent, a relatively stable institutional ensemble. And this is what Gramsci described in the prison notebooks. He used the term the historic bloc for a relatively stable phase, period of capitalist development where, in his words, structure and superstructure, economic, ideological, political, institutional elements, find a kind of congruence and stabilize each other. So we have this historic block of neoliberalism in the 1980s, developing in the 1980s, itself developing out of crisis management strategies. One must not forget the crisis management strategies deployed to counter the crisis of the 1970s, but that then solidify into a certain historic block of neoliberalism. But what really makes that, or made, depends on how you see it, makes that hegemonic is an interesting question, because if you look at critical historical analyses of the globalization of neoliberalism, and I mean there's a huge literature on this, and lots of it is in one way or the other informed by hegemony theory, by Gramsci. The whole school by now of so-called neo-Gramscian IPE, international political economy, tried to come to grasp with this neoliberal globalization. So the picture that emerges is, well, the neoliberal project was extremely effective in establishing a complex hegemonic apparatus on all political and geographical scales, from the global via the national states to the local. They managed, the part of the neoliberal project was the construction of a very strong consensus among political and economic elites that inscribed the political DNA, if you will, of neoliberalism into these institutions. And this, practically every major political, every major institution of the global political economy of at least from the 1990s onwards. However, although there appeared to be something like what Bourdieu called the pensée unique, the thinking that is, unique. Well, yeah, a pensée unique among the elites. Neoliberal hegemony was relatively weak when analyzed in light of Gramsci's integral conception of the term. I mean, this is obvious, I think, when one looks at the economic dimension. Practically all data that we have point to the fact that the neoliberal project was, in fact, what David Harvey famously described, a project of class struggle from above. It was far from organizing the sacrifices of an economic corporate kind that Gramsci deemed necessary for the exercise of hegemony, at least in most parts of the Northwestern world, and even more so in the global South and East. And neoliberal reforms produced you probably know that, but just to remind, it produced an enormous gap between a tiny minority materially benefiting from the policies of privatization, deregulation, financialization, flexibilization, marketization, and all that, what is usually labeled under this broad social reform program or counter-reform of neoliberalism. And on the other hand, it produced a vast majority relegated to precarious forms of labor and life, stagnating real incomes in large parts of the Western and Northern world, and increased dependency on the anarchic, if you will, volatilities of the markets via pension funds, via private debt, and all of this. And this fact, of course, was famously scandalized by the Occupy Wall Street movement when he talked about the 99%, which is in itself not a deep analysis, but it kind of captures this also this knowledge and this broad knowledge that neoliberalism did not produce any kind of economic compromise. And this is the reason why already in the early 2000s, a number of scholars from a Gramscian viewpoint argued that what we have here is a kind of fragmented or minimal hegemony, and some even argued that neoliberalism as a project is, Alex Demirovic, for example, German scholar, argued, neoliberalism as a project doesn't even care about hegemony. In its fullest sense, it is a project of a strategy based on the most narrowly defined economic interests of capital. It is an economic corporatist and not an hegemonic project. But neoliberalism, in turn, and I would argue, was also weak in a second sense, that is on the plane of discourse, or moral and ethical leadership. And this might seem a bit odd. This might seem like a bit an odd thing to say because, of course, there is compelling evidence that core elements of neoliberal ideology, a culture of individualism and consumerism, the belief in competition as the most basic feature of the human condition and so on, has indeed entered, has become part of the common sense of wide sections of the subaltern classes. in the global Northwest at least. However, I mean, Gramsci himself insisted that the common sense is always contradictory. He says it is necessarily fragmentary, incoherent, and inconsistent. And from a historical analysis, one could argue that the neoliberal project never managed to organize itself into what Gramsci called an expansive or progressive hegemony. That would be one that could formulate a positive program of progress and improvement and would attract the active and direct consensus of the subaltern classes. Instead, and again Mario Candeas, for example, argues this, and probably will argue this tomorrow night here, neoliberalism was based on a passive rather than active consensus. So what neoliberalism on a discursive level did was, it asked of its subjects a certain way of life that was largely accepted as a necessity in order not to drown in a world of permanent competition, enforced self-improvement, and so on, but it was not endorsed in any direct and active way by the majority of the subalterns, and it could not do so because it lacked the economic basis to do so. But how then did neoliberalism become hegemonic, or how did it at least organize the necessary popular support for this project of deep social transformation? And I think the answer lies in the neoliberal organic intellectuals. And in the beginning I said that the organic intellectuals, for Gramsci, they are they are organizers. It's not a question of manual or mental labor, but every person, every social force acting as an organizer of hegemony is considered by Gramsci as being, or as having the function of an organic intellectual. His core argument, of course, being that capital, the bourgeoisie, produces its own organic intellectuals on all levels, economic, politically, in the media, organizing hegemony through civil society. So we have these neoliberal organic intellectuals, and what they, including politicians, what they did, I think, was they were able to articulate their project with various other political, ideological, and cultural projects that are not themselves necessarily part of the neoliberal, not necessarily part of the neoliberal project itself. So this can be seen, for example, in the 1980s with the first rollout phase of neoliberalism, where Thatcherism, Reaganism, it was not a pure program of neoliberal reform, or counter-reform, if you will, but a complex economic, political, and cultural project in which the neoliberal project was articulated with a certain strand, in this case, of conservatism. So this concerned especially gender relations, a very patriarchal family ideal, also was linked to a specific discourse of nationalism and indeed racism that, for example, Stuart Hall back in the 1980s described as authoritarian populism. So the appeal, the popular support for neoliberal reform was garnered by connecting, by articulating different political, social, and economic and cultural projects. And you could argue that in the 1990s, with New Labour and third wave social democracy, the second big wave of neoliberalization in Europe, something similar occurred. But that in this case, it was not conservatism that was articulated with the neoliberal project, but a kind of communitarian. When you read the books by Anthony Giddens at that time, for example, or in the grand intellectual of German third wave social democracy, Jürgen Habermas, you find all these communitarian arguments, and also the incorporating of a number of demands that were present in the social movements from 1968 on, demands for individual freedom, from the bureaucratic rigidities of the Fordist phase of development, from patriarchal family norms, sexual norms, and so on, And this was articulated with the neoliberal program in a way that transformed these demands into market-conform diversity management, one would say probably, and transformed individual liberation, or transformed social liberation into a model of individual liberation through marketing identities. So in short, this argument claims that neoliberalism became hegemonic not because of its own positive content, but through its successful construction of links, of articulations with other projects. So that would be the two qualifications to the broad argument that I laid out before. Now, what would that mean for analysis of the current situation? I think first, it means that instead of expecting, this is just reiterating what I said before, instead of expecting a more or less direct dynamic leading towards stronger elements of force, coercion, and domination at the expense of elements of consensus, instead of this, I think it would be necessary to focus on the ways in which capital, through its state, both in its narrow sense, the political society, and its broader sense as the civil society, seeks to reconstruct its hegemony and leadership under the conditions of austerity, under the conditions of authoritarianism. And second, it means looking exactly into the way it does so through articulating this new phase of neoliberalism with new, or rather sometimes old, other social, political and cultural projects external to it. Just two quick examples. One would be new and old forms of racism that are now, especially in the core countries of Europe, on the rise. One sense, for example, the portrayal of people living in the southern European states as lazy, corrupt, incapable of living according to European standards. But you also could include elements of anti-Muslim racism that are very prevalent throughout Europe, through which the illusion of a common Judeo-Christian but at the same time enlightened European culture is constructed that offers moments of identification even for those subalterns in Europe that are threatened by this radicalized authoritarian austerity regime. A second example would, and again, I only touched this briefly, would be the reconstruction of gender identities and family norms, where socially necessary reproduction labor, and we see this very clearly in Greece right now, that for a period of time was at least partially socialized through the institutions of the welfare state, are now relegated back into the private sphere, into the household, and that means back usually into feminized, unpaid domestic labor. This also, I think, needs to be addressed, when looking at the crisis from a Gramscian perspective and the ways in which hegemony is trying to be reconstructed from the dominant side. And I think this is turns up interesting questions and opens up a number of, I'd say, potential arenas of struggle and possibilities also of politicizing questions of everyday discourse, praxis, and common sense. Okay. To conclude, I think 5 more minutes. Is that okay?
Yes.
Because it's not. There are not enough open questions in this room already, so I'll put up 2 more, which I think are pressing and very interesting challenges for political strategies at the moment. The first one is, and I touched this very briefly, and I hope we can discuss this during the next days and tonight. First is the complex relationship between the European dimension of the crisis and the national arenas of political struggle. I mean, it may be trivial to note, but of course, the way the crisis manifests itself in Europe is highly uneven, though combined, and it manifests itself in very, very different political circumstances. I mean, this is obviously the case when you compare the European core countries and the new periphery of Europe, Greece, Spain, Portugal, and so on. This, I'd say, relates to the different levels of hegemonic capacities that the ruling classes have in the respective countries. I mean, the room for minor economic concessions and compromises towards parts of the subaltern classes is small, but it is still, to a large degree, much, much higher in the core countries than it is in the European periphery. But not only this, you also have, and this is maybe even more peculiar, even within the core countries of Europe, where you have that share a very similar position. I mean, coming from Austria, this is a case that is very close to me. Even within the core of Europe, you have very, very different political situations. If you compare Austria and Germany, two countries that share a similar position politically, economically, that are tightly structurally linked with each other on all kinds of different levels, but you have a vastly different political situation, a vastly different balance of political forces, with obviously the Linkspartei in Deutschland, which, for example, makes this conference here possible through its Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, which makes a huge difference in debates in civil society in Germany, and although it's not as successful as one would maybe wish, it at least absorbs some of the anxieties and popular opposition to the European austerity regime. Whereas in Austria, the only significant political force benefiting from this is the extreme right-wing Freedom Party, which is a racist authoritarian party with significant minority currents that are fascist. So you have a relative autonomy, if you will, of the political situation, of the political strategies. And in this situation, it is sometimes, I think, a problem that, especially coming from, a country where the left is rather weak or is extremely weak, such as in Austria, and sometimes you have this appeal to the European level, which becomes easily an empty gesture, I'd say, an empty Europeanism that pushes away this very depressing work that you have to do on the ground, on a local level, on the national level, through the argument of saying, well, basically this is a European problem. We need to have European social movements, a European, Europe-wide trade union movement. We need to have mobilizations that are pan-European, and of course we need all that. But I mean, again, we can learn something from a formulation by Gramsci here, who says in the prison notebooks at one point that even though in advanced capitalism every major class, meaning the working class and the bourgeoisie, are structurally international in its content, in order to function politically, in order to rule politically, they have to, and his words are, nationalize themselves. So they have to translate themselves in the concrete historical material circumstances of the nation state. And I mean, the notions that he uses, popular, national, for hegemonic projects, indicate that. And I mean, it is certainly true for the national, for the ruling classes, that they need to nationalize themselves in order to rule politically. But this also, of course, structures the political terrain which the left operates and has to operate. So this would be one of the big challenges and questions, not to make this empty gesture towards Europe, but to engage with the realities on the ground in very, very differing, varying circumstances in different countries. And this leads me to the second and final point, and then I'll shut up. I mean, as you are well aware, with the crisis came a new wave of social mobilizations, of protests, of social struggles, and throughout the past years, and they do share some common characteristics, as again you are probably well aware of, such as occupation of public spaces and squares as a praxis to first of all make dissent visible in the public space, And this, in a way, I think, is, of course, the precondition for any progressive political project in a political situation where the ruling classes do not so much argue for their strategies in a politically expansive way, but declare what they are doing is, pure and simple, the only thing possible. This wonderful German word, alternativlos, one of the famous and most popular words with Chancellor Angela Merkel, which means, without any alternatives. This captures this strategy, I think, in its essence. And within those mobilizations that try to, make dissent visible, struggling subalterns seek and find new political practices of democracy, of collectivity, of common forms of organizing the basic reproductive needs of any social group, really. That these movements are internally extremely heterogeneous and contradictory in terms of ideology, in terms of strategic orientations, should, I think, surprise nobody. And Gramsci wouldn't be the least bit surprised of that. And I think it is also probably common ground among us here, that the task of politically organized activists of the left is not lecturing them, the social movements and these protesters, from the sidelines, telling them about what really matters. It's about class, it's about capitalism, it's about oppression, it's about hegemony, and so on. But I believe that there is, the need to argue from within these movements and from within these protests for the importance of a lot of questions, but for the importance of one question that I want to pick up now, and that is, I think, one of the biggest challenges. And the question is, of course, as old as probably anti-capitalist movements and capitalism itself, and this is how do we relate to the state? How can we produce mechanisms that link the autonomous movements with those political forces, organizations, coalitions, parties, in those cases where they exist, that challenge authoritarian neoliberalism on the terrain of the capitalist state? And again, here with Gramsci, we can think about the state not just as the parliament and the executive, but as part of a broader integral state, including civil society. And I mean, my own experiences as an activist in Austria, and as an activist who always compares, his situation with the comrades in Germany, because one travels back and forth and reads the same papers and discusses online and in person. From this perspective, comparing the two situations in Austria and Germany, the need for such a political dimension of opposition, of political organization, is strongly reinforced. So how this challenge is addressed, how to relate political organizations on the terrain of the capitalist state and autonomous movements and forms of protests to each other, is, I think, one of the biggest challenges lying ahead, and is also something that could be, I think, interestingly debated in terms that Gramsci provides us with. So I hope we have the opportunity to talk about some of these questions maybe tonight and maybe in the next 2 days. And with this open question, I thank you very much for your patience, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benjamin. And yes, many questions have been raised, I believe. So, but this is now your chance to either comment on some of them or add your own. So we have until 8. So there is quite some time for discussion. So please, who wants to break the ice? No one.
Thanks, man, for the presentation. And I take it you're also taking a little bit of inspiration from the Austrian context, when not only that the left is losing its people, that the workers are not even voting anymore with the Social Democrats, but have gone right now straight with the neoliberals. But I take it also on the more general level, your argument goes, if I get it right, a bit as a criticism against ways of revolting or building resistance against hegemony that are taken to be the same thing as revolting against authority and oppression. And yeah, I agree that, you know, power operates also positively, so spectacle, seduction, you know, framed resistance, and that there is right now a restructuring of, let's say, the centrist liberals who are building a new forms of consensus as we talk, even by participating in anti-systemic movements right now. But the question that comes then from, let's say, an anti-systemic perspective, or is that thus far, the strategy, the anti-systemic strategy post-89 has been mostly an autonomist one. So how does then, what would be, you ended right there where I would like it to go further, you know, indeed, because this is the question then, like if autonomists or all kinds of independent, alternative, anti-systemic movements prefer building their own spaces, their own alliances and networks, therefore rejecting the political totality built through force and consent together, then what is the consequence for the autonomist political strategy? Moving the question further to the capitalist state, as you put. Does that mean stepping into electoral politics, for instance? Does that mean...
I'll help. Well, I first want to thank you for the lecture. It was very, very interesting and very pleasing to hear that there are many questions and problems that are shared within the European context, as it wasn't so often obvious that they are shared. We were sometimes relatively suspicious whether the same problems occur and so on. But this is clarified now that there are many shared problems, and obviously there are then many questions and comments I would make, but I will only focus on one. When you said that from the Gramscian perspective, the neoliberal hegemony in itself is inherently weak, or the way it was in its normal dynamic formed, it is weak. It was very interesting for me because it is not unusual today that many of the leftists start their talks and analysis by saying, okay, we find ourselves in a kind of crisis of democracy or crisis of legitimacy, and they refer to the fact, more or less, that the austerity measures, these harsh neoliberal measures that we are facing today are logically could not be democratic, as they are not social in any way, as they are not defending the interests of the majority. But also, and I think this is more or less always ignored or forgotten, is that if we look at the democratic procedures that are actually existing in these societies, in many cases these measures are very democratically elected. There are majorities voting for them and so on. And then now I think that when you mentioned this concept or this diagnosis that the neoliberal hegemony is weak in itself, maybe this would give us another light, another look at this situation, and take us in a different direction where we wouldn't base our analysis on the fact that things are going our way, at this point, that the way that the neoliberal legitimization is functioning is something that is not going like it should or like it was going. That maybe now this is not normal or usual, but it is also not so unusual as it sometimes seems. And I would maybe like if you could draw upon this or go further.
Thank you for the questions and comments, and both of them really draw upon. I mean, it's my own fault if you put up the big questions. It's the big questions that get thrown back to you. But I mean, they are big questions because I think they are important. Regarding your question. How to relate from the viewpoint of autonomous anti-systemic movements and networks towards how to relate to the state. I mean, first of all, it seems it might seem that I want to circumvent the question, but I think I'm really not. First of all, from a Gramscian viewpoint, one would probably have to argue that to be without and against the state is, a structural illusion. It is not possible. The idea of integral state, of civil society, integral state that encompasses civil society and political society, would say, well, the way in which the public is organized under capitalism is one that never fully escapes the logic of capital and the logic of political, the political form of capitalism and the state. So in one way or the other, and be it the most autonomous form of organization, is part of this power structure, is part of the state, and they try, they have to relate to the state in one way or the other, and to reject the state and maybe to combat the state at certain points is a way of relating to the state, and is a way of being part of, in the end, of civil society. But in a more concrete way, I mean, of course, I'm very sorry to say that I'm largely ignorant, probably, concerning the conjunctures of the political and social movements in the region here. But what I find really interesting is when I look into the German context, where you have a strong autonomous scene, and you have a long history of autonomous struggles, and you have these networks and anti-systemic political forces. Those that in the past, I'd say 3, 4, 5 years, really made significant efforts and had some, I think, really important role in major mobilizations, for example, in Frankfurt, as part of the bloc, a big protest against European crisis management. Those that played a role there themselves transformed, in being part of a large. I mean, it was a long process. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with it. There's this alliance of autonomous political groups and networks called the Interventionistische Linke, the interventionist left, that tried to develop a perspective that still is anti-systemic, is clearly anti-capitalist and revolutionary, and comes out of the experience of the autonomous movement in Germany, but sees the opportunity to participate in broader political contexts, for example, in the alliance that mobilized for the protests in Frankfurt, and that this opposition between those on the left that are state-centric or relate to the state in a way as the Linkspartei, for example, does, and those that completely reject to have anything to do with it. This dichotomy, at least in Germany, it seems to me, seems to crumble, seems to fade away. In part, to be honest, because of this very institution that sponsors this workshop, the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. I mean, it's almost funny. You have long-standing autonomous groups and alliances in Germany that now, finance themselves in part, at least, through the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung, which means they get the money because the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung makes a certain percentage of the vote in a national election, because this is where the money comes from. It comes from the state. It's state money. And I don't think that this is a sellout or anything. I think this is actually a very interesting development, because it forces both the political state-oriented parts of the left and the autonomous left to rethink their relationship with each other. I mean, this is of course not an exhaustive answer, and I don't have one. This is especially because this is a political answer, and political answers are always, as Lenin said, concrete. Well, Lenin quote. But yeah, I think the experience, at least in Germany, points towards a direction that I think is very, very interesting in this sense. And to your comment, I think you're right that in a sense my argument would be that, first of all, you're absolutely right. I think that the argument would be that this situation in Europe right now for the left is not good. It's who would have thought? But it's there is a sense of in some parts of the left that has this apocalyptic, this catastrophism discourse. Winter is coming. That the contradictions are getting riper and riper, and sooner or later it must blow up. And of course, I mean, you look at Greece, and you get that impression. I mean, it's not fantasy. It's not really Game of Thrones. It's it's based on a sound analysis. But the idea that at the moment where force and violence comes to the fore in the way that political power is orchestrated, that then somehow, and I mean, this goes back to you have passages in Marx in Capital where he insinuates that the further the internal contradictions of capital accumulation, the further they go, that sooner or later you have the two classes, class against class, unveiled of any political or cultural or ideological masks. And I mean, this was wrong back then, and it is wrong right now. It's not class against class in Greece right now. You have a significant section of the working class in Greece supporting openly an openly fascist organization. You have a significant part of the working class which is not even part of the polis, because they are migrants or non-citizens with no right to vote. So you have all these intersecting lines, and you have this enormous effort on the part of the ruling classes, both in Europe, on the European level, both and on the national level, to base this violent and forceful authoritarian policies on the consent. I mean, that's what they do. They do it all the time. So yes, I think that would be one important argument, political, strategical argument that I want to make, and that I think can be made quite well by referring to Gramsci. And this also implies, as you said, that the situation is not so. I mean, it's a situation of crisis, and this means this has very important repercussions. But it's not like, okay, we have 1980 something until 2008, and you had perfect. Everybody was a neoliberal subject with the market in its head, and then comes the break, and everybody's like, wow, what the fuck happened? And we should really think about that neoliberal thing here. So no, I mean, it was a weak hegemony to begin with, and it was a weak hegemony that could survive because, I would argue, it managed to absorb, to integrate, to articulate itself with other projects that were not, communitarianism or conservative nationalism, it's not inherently neoliberal, but it was combined, it was absorbed. There's an interesting concept by Gramsci that I haven't mentioned yet, which is called the passive revolution or transformismo, where he tries to, in his historical analysis, capture maybe quite similar quite similar dynamics, where parts of social movements or oppositionist movements are integrated into a broader sense of hegemony. So this is also, I think, a way to think about that.
So one thing you mentioned, I think, is very important, even for the left now, thinking about its own tactics. It's to go beyond this naive opposition between consent and coercion. That so you mentioned this naive notion of hydraulics of power, where if where force rises, consent necessarily has to fall. But what I think is very interesting and really maybe something which has not been adequately addressed is the question that coercion has to produce its own form of consent. So, but if we then, and I may here now nevertheless introduce a seemingly hydraulic argument, but from a different maybe entry point. But if you have a situation where basically a certain level of economic gains or compromises to the subaltern classes, which have, in Marxist terms, which have become a sort of historical and moral standard of reproduction, let's say, of social reproduction, if that is attacked, and this is attacked not out of sheer, caprice, but because of the underlying dynamics of the development of capitalist crisis in the 70s and so on. And as you have said, neoliberalism was an attempt to solve that crisis at that point. That would imply that this lowering of the historical standard or historical moral standards of reproduction, this redefinition of the horizon of expectations, this has to be at one point, as you have, well, the very notion of authoritarian neoliberalism basically names that tendency that, well, now coercion is coming more aggressively to the fore. But at the same time, of course, for it to function, it has to produce new forms of its own legitimation, or an organization of consent. And this, of course, one could argue, well, you have mentioned nationalism, racism, and so on, but one additional thing maybe would be an attempt to integrate, even hegemonically integrate, seemingly or potentially anti-systemic impulses into a hegemonic project of preservation, that is, of legitimizing this new constellation. And historically, I would argue that would be a formula, the formula of fascism, where this pseudo-revolutionary rhetorics or anti-systemic rhetorics, leading then to basically being functionally integrated into a hegemonic constellation of preservation. So what the left would need, I would say, now is to attack first the plausibility of these narratives, the plausibility of these narratives of legitimizing these this new constellation of factors. If economic gains are withdrawn and systematically attacked, and this has to be done through coercion, well, one has to expect a more aggressive and new forms of legitimizing these. And this is where the left has to be very careful, because if it doesn't, then it opens the space for the right-wing narratives to do so. I mean, I don't know if it's a question or a comment.
Maybe leading on to this, there is currently an initiative put up for a European referendum on the guaranteed basic income, and signatures are being collected. So I'm wondering, maybe intended or unintended, maybe this would be kind of a moment of compensation from the ruling classes, ruling elites, corporatist ruling elites, because there is this, of course, moral impetus that everybody should have a decent wage, but some ideas on how this should be financed are to finance it in part from the impending collapse of social services, social welfare state, and all of this. So what we would get probably, instead of an institutional widespread network of social services, welfare state, public education or whatever, with stakeholders in that system, we would get like a single decree stressing upon individual autonomy that is seemingly social, yet very easily revocable and positioned like in this moral universe. So, and moreover, fought for by the people collecting signatures for it and on referendum. So, could you maybe comment on that?
It's not a question, or it's a comment, or I want to add to your previous answer to the problem of weakness of neoliberal hegemony during this period before the crisis. Yes, I can agree it was a weak in the sense that you described, but it functioned properly. In a sense that that I think there are three more reasons to add to it. One being this Stipe was mentioning this attack on the historical and moral standard of the reproduction, but this attack in terms of producing the effective demand in the 80s and 90s was what we had in terms, it was inflation of credits to the household. I think that was also the one major part of this establishing the hegemony, or in the economic sense of postponing the resolution of contradictions of capitalism. The other thing was also, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union as a part of the global, some kind of hegemonic constellation. Of course, the Soviet Union already in the 70s and 80s didn't have this kind of political impact, but it was, and it didn't, of course, didn't promise. It didn't realize its promises from the beginning, but of course it somehow functioned as a second pole in the global relations. And the two part of it that I think maybe the most relevant one was the devastation of the leftist organizations and parties and leftist infrastructures in the 80s and the 90s, because any kind of for the people as such in terms of their atomized individual lives, any kind of, if we can speak about that, of breaking the hegemony on the individual level, there was no any kind of other political factor that could move in from the left in a sense. I think that also somehow contributed to the be it weak but very functional neoliberal hegemony.
Thank you. Yeah. I think I'll react in reverse order. To your 3 points, I think I basically agree with probably all of them. And what I did is I definitely did not talk enough about the political economic basis of neoliberalism in the way that you just described, which would be absolutely necessary. I would definitely agree that financialization and especially private debt was the precondition for neoliberalism economically to work as a hegemonic project, because it was kind of the functional equivalent to the Keynesian Fordist material compromise. But it was, of course, it was based on debt in the sense of a bubble. And this is one of the internal contradictions I just briefly mentioned when I said, okay, it is a crisis of neoliberal capitalism because it is a crisis growing out of its specifically historical contradictions, and this is, I think, one of the most important ones. Debt, private debt, and also public debt as a functional equivalent of Keynesian Fordist economic compromise. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, well, I think probably partly agree. I'd rather more stress the importance of the processes of accumulation by dispossession that were made possible. No new fields of accumulation that were opened up after '89, and that somehow postpones the inherent crisis of accumulation that was about to come. And which then came in the late 2000s, and the devastation of left infrastructure and the defeat of the left I would say yes, of course. And I mean, neoliberalism as one decisive. I mean, when we say neoliberalism is a form of class struggle from above and a political class struggle, it's not just meant, okay, wages are cut down, pensions are financialized, and so on, infrastructures, social infrastructure, welfare state is demolished. But it was a class struggle in a very literal sense. I mean, it was on the backs of the miners in the UK. It was on the back of the Flughafen, airport, air controllers in the United States, and so it was fought out class struggle, and the destruction of trade union structures, of left infrastructure, as you said, that was one precondition, or was part and parcel of the inner core, I would say, of the neoliberal project. This is what they wanted to achieve: bring profit rates back up by slashing down on organized labor, among other things. Then again, I would say, I mean, left infrastructure. If we look at the 1990s and early 2000s, I mean, this is exactly what re-emerged in the context of the new social movements after 1999, Seattle, Genova, and those things. But this is different thing. The basic income as a new potential economic basis for hegemonic project. I'm not sure if I understood you right, but I'm kind of torn here, because I believe that a properly a proper basic income, regardless of that is as defined as a human right, I think is a very attractive demand, especially because it is incompatible with any form of capitalism. The forms of basic income that are put on the table as very pragmatic reforms, you can collect signatures for it, and then you go to some European institution, and then you say, please, could we have a basic income? Can, of course, as you said, backfire in the way that you insinuated. Thing is that this is and it can then be integrated into a neoliberal hegemonic project. The thing is, this is the case with probably almost all reformists, or with all kinds of drives, with all kinds of things that one could fight for. And this is the history of neoliberalism, that exactly even those demands that one thought would be radically anti-systemic, with the 1968 and 70s movements, turned out to be integratable into a neoliberal hegemonic project. So this in itself would not be, for me, a reason to flat out reject the idea of a basic income. And to Stipe, yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree with you. I mean, the integration of anti-systemic impulses, I think it's very interesting to think about the fascist option in this very way. And I mean, this is, if we look at, again, I mean, Greece, this laboratory really, it's like taking a microscope and looking into what really, is boiling there. I mean, of course, I mean, Golden Dawn is presenting itself as an anti-systemic force, and the only really credible opposition to European crisis management. In Austria, the Freedom Party is the only party running a campaign, the only significant party running a campaign on these topics. And then everybody from the Social Democrats to the Greens, not to talk about liberals and conservatives, of course they say the same. But I mean, what the Social Democrats and the Greens said in the last elections just a couple of weeks ago in Austria was, well, it's not as bad here as it is anywhere else, so we're not doing too bad. And what happens in Europe? Well, this is technical stuff. Yeah, we don't have any option, but what should we do? The only political force that politicized these issues was in this case the right wing, and they, of course, give it an anti-systemic edge. Although in the case of the Freedom Party in Austria, as I said, it's not a classic fascist party. It has, I think, fascist elements, but this is exactly what you said. one indicator of how internally contradictory this party is it has a kind of anti-systemic appeal, but then a very strong drive to be integrated into the system. The first thing that the leader of the Freedom Party said after election night was, "Now everybody has to talk to us. Now is the time. They can no longer, ignore us. We want to be part of the next government," and so on and so on. And concerning the lowering horizon of expectation, this I think is a very interesting point, because this is basically what happened in the 25 years of neoliberal capitalism, which is.
But there was this, as Marco mentioned, there was this line. There was the economic credit as the economic precondition of making individualist solutions plausible. Mm-hmm. This now, at least, has at the infrastructural level, at the economic level, collapsed.
Yeah. But even at an economic level, it was a very hard position to sustain back in the 80s and 90s. Except for various certain circumstances where you had, IT bubble, or you were in Ireland in the beginning of the 2000s. But the ideology of meritocracy, of this idea that one could individually work him or herself up the ranks. It was always, I think, mainly an ideology, a cultural thing, and even in the most depressing parts of Berlin suburbs, this is probably the most strong ideological element in common sense that relates to TV casting shows. This is basically the best metaphor for this kind of ideological element. That individually you can always make it, of course, and you don't need much of an economic base to still believe that.
One thing just now, just as a, it just came up to me now. Well, if we say that this meritocratic discourse, this idea that through your if you try hard enough and work hard enough, and this whole concept of on your human capital and so forth, you will succeed. And of course, the economic foundation, to a large extent, of the economic precondition, maybe of withdrawing classical Keynesian or social welfare webs of security or institutions of security, has been that this has been to a certain extent compensated by what Robert Brenner has called privatized Keynesianism, that is privatized private debt and so on and so on. But wouldn't you say that, I don't know, it's just a hypothesis, but that to a certain extent this meritocratic discourse in its positive form is in crisis, but now its negative form is a sort of social chauvinism. This, this in terms of, it is now being turned against those who, in German, Hartz-IV-Empfänger, those people who depend on social security and so on and so on. So even the crisis of that particular narrative or discursive constellation or the ideology, however you want to call it, its crisis may produce an even more vicious form of it in terms of this social chauvinism, and that again is something that could feed on potentially on FPÖ and fascism in its classical form.
Yeah, I think I would agree, and
You can just agree.
yeah, okay.
It's 8 o'clock.
It's 8 o'clock.
Okay.
So you can
Yeah.
just agree.
Then this is a good last word. Agreement.
Okay. So thank you, Benjamin. Thanks to all of you for coming. Just to announce, to remind you that of course this was just the beginning. Tomorrow at 10 at this very same place we'll have our first panel, Tomislav Medak and Daniela Dolenec. So these are our own local forces, theoretical and political, and so you're all invited, of course.